It was one of those English snows that descend without warning and, with quiet obstinacy, proceed to erase the familiar world entirely. I had been watching from our first-class compartment window as we departed King's Cross that morning, observing the landscape gradually transform from the soot-stained browns and greys of London to the rolling countryside beyond. By early afternoon, what had begun as a gentle dusting had evolved into something far more determined, and by the time our train, the Northern Highland Express, bound for the winter charity festivities at Marchmont Hall, reached the desolate stretches beyond Darlington, there was nothing visible but white. White fields, white hedgerows, white sky pressing down like a woolen blanket, and that peculiar muffled hush that makes one think of a theatre just before the curtain rises. My companion, Hercule Poirot, sat opposite me, in his customary state of meticulous arrangement. He had prepared for the journey with military precision, his valise stowed at exact right angles beneath the seat, his umbrella positioned in the rack with its ferrule aligned precisely to the left, his gloves folded with geometric perfection in the crown of his hat. That immaculate handkerchief, of which he is absurdly proud, peeped from his cuff as though to provide constant reassurance that order still reigned in at least one small corner of the universe. The increasing snowfall, I observed, was causing him considerable irritation. He regarded it through the window with the expression one might reserve for an impudent waiter in a third-rate establishment. "Mon ami," he said, tapping the glass with one precisely manicured finger, "this English enthusiasm for irregular precipitation, it is not rational. Snow, it is very charming in a Christmas card, n'est-ce pas? On the Champs-Élysées, perhaps, if one is properly attired, and the pavements do not conspire to assassinate one's dignity. But to send a train into such conditions, a train which prides itself upon punctuality and proper scheduling, mais non." I couldn't help but laugh at his indignation. "The Northern Highland Express has weathered worse storms than this, Poirot. Besides, Lady Isabel Marchmont will hardly blame us if we arrive somewhat behind schedule." At the mention of that distinguished name, I noticed a subtle stirring in the corridor outside our compartment. Our carriage, one of the finest first-class saloons, specially arranged at Lady Isabel's request, housed a most intriguing collection of passengers. It was to be a house party in the grand tradition, assembled for the annual winter charity gala at Marchmont Hall. Lady Isabel herself was one of those formidable women of impeccable breeding and inexhaustible energy who could command a room without appearing to exert the slightest effort. I confess I had been somewhat flattered to receive her invitation, though naturally it was Poirot's reputation she sought to add luster to her charitable endeavors. The passenger manifest read like a page from Debrett's mixed with entries from Who's Who. In the compartment adjacent to ours sat Miss Beatrice Lyle, Lady Isabel's companion, a woman of perhaps 45 with an anxious countenance and a perpetual lapful of knitting. I had exchanged pleasantries with her at King's Cross and noted that beneath her self-effacing manner lay a spine of surprising steel, evidenced by the determined set of her jaw whenever anyone spoke sharply in her vicinity. 2 doors along, Sir Everard Venn occupied a compartment entirely to himself, as befitted a man of his considerable wealth and influence. The American industrialist had made his fortune in petroleum and motor manufacturing, and his presence commanded attention even in repose. I had observed him earlier, imperiously directing the porter regarding his attaché case, a battered leather affair that he insisted must remain in his personal custody at all times. His secretary, a pale young man named Felix Dane with an unfortunate prominence of Adam's apple, hovered about his employer with the devotion of a well-trained spaniel. The remaining passengers formed an equally fascinating tableau. Mrs. Constance Whitfield, a philanthropic widow possessed of both considerable fortune and the bearing of a retired galleon, had commandeered the corner seat in the observation car and proceeded to survey her fellow travelers with the keen eye of a seasoned admiral. Mr. Hugo Drake, whose latest theatrical satire had scandalized London society the previous season, entertained a small audience with witticisms that danced dangerously close to impropriety. Dr. Leopold Hargreaves of Harley Street maintained his professional composure while clearly cataloguing the neuroses of his traveling companions, and Captain Gerald Kinross regaled anyone within earshot with tales of military adventure, his crisp mustache bristling with each animated gesture. Perhaps most intriguing of all was Miss Eleanor Marchmont, Lady Isabel's niece, whose striking profile and air of determined independence suggested a young woman unimpressed by either wealth or title. She had positioned herself by a window, ostensibly reading, but I noticed her gaze frequently shifting to observe the other passengers with an intensity that spoke of more than casual interest. "An interesting assemblage," I remarked to Poirot. He adjusted the crease in his trousers with fastidious precision. "Interesting, yes. Harmonious. Décidément, non. I detect the little tensions, the discordant notes. Observe, mon bon Hastings, the secretary who watches his employer's every gesture with the intensity of a starving man regarding a banquet, the young lady who maintains her chin at a defiant angle even when no challenge is present, the widow who notes with mathematical precision every social interaction in the carriage, the military gentleman whose laughter rings perhaps too heartily to be entirely genuine. It is an orchestra of stringed instruments, each slightly out of tune. It requires only the smallest pressure, a touch upon the bow, to produce a most unpleasant screech." "You are being fanciful," I protested, though with affection. One grows accustomed to Poirot's elaborate metaphors and learns to await the inevitable revelation that proves their accuracy. That revelation was not long in coming. At precisely 9:15, our smooth progress faltered. The engine's rhythmic pulse hesitated, attempted to resume its normal cadence, then gradually diminished to an uncertain murmur. The familiar, swaying motion of the carriage grew irregular, and finally, with a prolonged sigh of steam and metal, the Northern Highland Express shuddered to a complete halt. "Tiens," observed Poirot with considerable understatement. An expectant silence settled over the carriage, that particular quality of quiet that descends upon a railway compartment when the train is no longer moving. It possesses the same theatrical tension as the moment before the curtain rises, when the audience holds its collective breath in anticipation of the drama to unfold. After several minutes, Mr. Ellison, the guard, a square-shouldered man with weathered hands and an apologetic demeanor, appeared in the corridor, knocking respectfully at each compartment door. "Begging your pardon, ladies and gentlemen," he announced with practiced courtesy. "We've encountered rather more snow than anticipated. The driver believes we can reverse a short distance and attempt another approach. Best to remain seated until we receive word from the signal box. Shouldn't be too much longer." This last statement was delivered with the cheerful mendacity common to railway employees facing circumstances beyond their control. We settled in to wait. There is something about a snowstorm that makes one acutely aware of time's passage and the fragility of human arrangements when pitted against nature's indifference. The carriage grew perceptibly colder, though not uncomfortably so. Mrs. Whitfield rapped sharply on her window and declared herself thoroughly disgusted with the entire situation. Captain Kinross launched into an elaborate tale involving a toboggan in the Swiss Alps that coaxed a reluctant smile from Miss Eleanor despite her obvious preoccupation. Mr. Drake made several pointed observations about English weather being as unpredictable as English drama, while Miss Lyle dropped her knitting needles and offered fluttered apologies to no one in particular. Throughout this minor chaos, Poirot remained a model of composed tranquility. He leaned forward once to remove, with exquisite delicacy, an imaginary speck of lint from his cuff. "A snowstorm," he observed at length, "is very much like a false beard, mon ami. It provides everyone with a little disguise. One cannot see the true road, only the whiteness that conceals it, but then, poof! When it melts away, there is the road revealed and, perhaps also, the little footprints that one did not notice before." It was at this precise moment that the disturbance began. First came a sharp rapping from somewhere further along the corridor, followed by Mr. Dane's voice, pitched with unmistakable anxiety. "Sir Everard? Sir Everard, the guard requires— Sir, please." Every head in our vicinity turned toward the sound. The handle of a door rattled with increasing desperation. "He's locked himself in," came Mr. Dane's voice again, now edged with genuine alarm. "Sir, can you hear me?" The guard's heavier footsteps approached at a measured pace. "What seems to be the difficulty, sir?" "He doesn't respond. He never locks his door unless— Sir Everard, please." A ripple of unease passed through the carriage like an electric current. Compartment doors opened as passengers emerged to investigate the commotion. Mrs. Whitfield's eyes brightened with the unmistakable gleam of one who sensed scandal, while Captain Kinross immediately took charge of the situation with military efficiency. Dr. Hargreaves appeared as if summoned by professional instinct, and Lady Isabel materialized with the composed authority of one accustomed to managing crises. "Mr. Ellison," she directed with quiet command, "please use your discretion." "Very good, my lady." The guard touched his cap respectfully and produced his master key. It met with immediate resistance. Bolts engaged from the inside. "Sir Everard." Mr. Dane's complexion had assumed an alarming greyish pallor. His renewed knocking was feeble, almost apologetic. "Sir, only say something." Captain Kinross stepped forward decisively. "Stand aside." He looked to Mr. Ellison for confirmation, received a reluctant nod, and applied his shoulder to the door. The first attempt merely shook the frame. The second produced an ominous splintering sound that drew a small cry from Miss Lyle. The third assault succeeded with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire carriage. The door swung inward to reveal Sir Everard Venn's private compartment in a state of considerable disarray. The industrial magnate himself lay sprawled beside the window seat, one arm flung outward, the other pinned beneath his considerable bulk. His famous attaché case, the one he had guarded so jealously, sat open upon the seat, its contents apparently removed. The window blind was half drawn, and snow had accumulated against the glass in intricate patterns that seemed almost decorative in their delicacy. A walking stick with an ornate silver handle had rolled into the corner, where it remained as if reluctant to return to its owner's service. Most significantly, the key to the compartment lay on the floor just inside the door, clearly having been turned from within. "Please stand back," Dr. Hargreaves said quietly, his professional manner immediately asserting itself. He knelt beside the motionless figure, his examination swift but thorough. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he raised his head and addressed Lady Isabel with grave certainty. "I regret to inform you that Sir Everard Venn is deceased." In that instant, with the snow pressing insistently against the windows and the corridor filled with shocked faces, I experienced that peculiar sensation I had known during my service in France. The feeling that the world had not quite overturned, but that one could sense it beginning to tilt toward some inevitable catastrophe. Poirot, who had remained a respectful pace behind me throughout the commotion, now approached the threshold without entering the compartment. He stood perfectly erect, his keen eyes moving systematically about the scene, not to the body, but to the room itself. The key, the window, the rifled attaché case, and a small torn fragment of paper that had caught on the edge of the seat like a pennant at half-mast. He made no move to disturb this potential evidence, regarding it with the same careful attention one might give to a rare butterfly that had alighted on a perfect flower. "Monsieur Ellison," he said, his voice soft yet commanding enough to draw the attention of everyone present, "you will be so good as to secure all compartment doors. No one enters, no one departs. We are, as you say, snowbound." "Très bien. Then for the present, we must also be bound by other considerations, by prudence, by necessity, and by respect for the dead." Lady Isabel's chin lifted with characteristic resolve. "Monsieur Poirot." He inclined his head with old-world courtesy. "Madame, if it is your wish, I place my humble abilities at your disposal. But let us first observe the proper courtesies toward one who can no longer speak for himself." He stepped aside to allow Dr. Hargreaves to arrange the limbs with professional dignity, to cover the face with Mr. Dane's trembling handkerchief, and to pronounce with the steady voice of one who had delivered such verdicts before the final end of what had begun many decades earlier in the industrial heartland of America. The snow continued its relentless assault on the windows, as if seeking entry to witness the drama unfolding within. Behind me, Mrs. Whitfield whispered something that sounded distinctly like "murder most foul," while Miss Lyle began counting her knitting stitches aloud with the desperate precision of one seeking refuge in familiar routine. "Attention, Hastings," murmured Poirot beside me, speaking not as the great detective addressing the world, but as one friend confiding in another. "When a train stops moving, people naturally look outward to discover the cause. When a life stops, they look inward to find the reason. We, mon ami, shall do both." And with those words, the stage was set for what would prove to be one of the most intricate and psychologically complex cases in Poirot's distinguished career. A mystery that would test not only his legendary powers of deduction, but his profound understanding of the human heart, in all its capacity for both love and betrayal. The dining saloon of the Northern Highland Express, with its mahogany paneling and crystal fixtures, had been transformed by circumstance into something resembling a tribunal. The snow continued its relentless assault against the tall windows, each flake seeming to press closer as if seeking entry to witness the drama unfolding within. Poirot positioned himself not at the head of the polished table, but slightly to one side, where he could observe without appearing to dominate, a strategic choice that spoke to his understanding of human psychology under stress. The immediate aftermath of Sir Everard's discovery had produced that peculiar suspension of normal social order that accompanies any profound shock. Mrs. Constance Whitfield, recovering first from her initial stupefaction, had immediately assumed command with the authority of one accustomed to organizing charity committees and managing recalcitrant servants. Her voice carried across the saloon with practiced efficiency as she directed Dr. Hargreaves to provide more definitive answers about the cause of death, though the physician maintained his professional reserve with admirable firmness. "Madame," Dr. Hargreaves replied with courteous but unmistakable authority, "I cannot make such determinations under these circumstances. What I can say with certainty is that Sir Everard has been deceased for some time, perhaps as much as an hour, judging by the condition of the extremities and the ambient temperature of the compartment." This pronouncement sent a visible tremor through the assembled group. Mr. Felix Dane, whose complexion had progressed from grey to an alarming shade of green, clutched at the doorframe for support. His voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "An hour. But that means—" When I knocked earlier to inform him about the delay, he was already— The young man's words failed him entirely, and he sank into the nearest chair with the deflated posture of one whose world has suddenly shifted beneath his feet. Lady Isabel, demonstrating the composure that had made her a formidable presence in London society, took charge of the practical arrangements with characteristic efficiency. "Mr. Ellison," she addressed the guard with quiet authority, "what provisions exist for communicating with the authorities? Surely there must be telegraph connections at the signal boxes along this route." The guard shook his head with evident regret, his weathered face reflecting genuine concern. "Afraid not, my lady. The lines have been down since the storm began in earnest, brought down by the weight of ice and snow on the poles. We're quite cut off until the weather clears enough for a rescue engine to reach us, and that could be hours or even the better part of a day, depending on how the wind drives the drifts." Captain Kinross stepped forward with military decisiveness, his bearing automatically assuming command of what he perceived as a tactical situation. "Then we must maintain proper order and preserve the scene. Guard, The compartment must be secured against any disturbance. Nothing must be touched until proper authorities can conduct their investigation." "Precisely, mon capitaine," said Poirot, speaking for the first time since his initial observations at the scene. His voice carried that particular quality of gentle authority that commanded attention without demanding it. "We find ourselves in what one might term a closed circle, a situation beloved of novelists but rather less comfortable in reality. We are, as circumstances have decreed, quite alone with our thoughts, our memories, and our individual relationships with the deceased." Miss Eleanor Marchmont, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, now spoke with quiet intensity that drew every eye in the saloon. "Then we are truly isolated. No communication with the outside world, no possibility of official investigation until the storm passes and proper authorities can reach us." Her gaze moved deliberately from face to face, and I noticed that each person she looked upon seemed to shift uncomfortably under her scrutiny. Mr. Hugo Drake, whose theatrical instincts had been temporarily subdued by the gravity of the situation, now reasserted themselves with characteristic flair, though his usual buoyancy seemed forced. How perfectly Gothic! A snowbound train, a mysterious death, a collection of suspects with no possibility of escape. It's rather like something from one of those sensational novels, isn't it? All we lack is a mysterious inheritance and a dark family secret. "This is hardly the time for levity," Dr. Hargreaves responded sharply, though I noticed his own eyes held a glitter of professional interest that suggested he found the situation rather more intriguing than his stern manner indicated. Poirot moved with careful deliberation toward the entrance of the saloon, his keen eyes taking in the positioning of each person, the subtle tensions in their postures, the way certain individuals avoided looking directly at others. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice carrying easily through the confined space, "there has been an unfortunate occurrence. Sir Everard Venn is dead, found in his compartment with the door bolted from within and his private papers apparently disturbed. In such circumstances, wisdom suggests we treat the matter with appropriate gravity." The expected murmurs followed, carefully modulated expressions of shock, staged exclamations of disbelief, and telling silences from those who seemed to be calculating rather than reacting. Only Mr. Dane made no sound at all, staring at his hands as if they had somehow betrayed him. "The storm prevents immediate assistance from the authorities," Poirot continued with quiet gravity. "Thus, we must assist ourselves with order and method. I propose that we establish, for the benefit of official investigation when it becomes possible, a clear sequence of events from the moment our train halted until the discovery of Sir Everard's body." Mrs. Whitfield drew herself up with indignant authority. "You mean to say that we are to be treated as criminals because of a snowdrift? I'm a patron of numerous charitable organizations, and I hardly think—" "To the cause of good sense you will also contribute, madame," Poirot interrupted with a slight bow that somehow managed to be both respectful and firm. "For the moment, we shall do nothing that cannot later be undone, and we shall avoid what cannot be undone." His eyes rested meaningfully on Mr. Drake's unlit cigarette. "No flames, if you please. Smoke is the great destroyer of little truths that might otherwise speak to us." Miss Beatrice Lyle, who had been counting knitting stitches with increasing desperation throughout this exchange, suddenly looked up with wide, frightened eyes. But if it wasn't natural, if someone actually— She couldn't complete the thought, but her meaning was unmistakable to everyone present. "Then," said Captain Kinross grimly, his military bearing becoming more pronounced, "the perpetrator is still among us, trapped by the same storm that prevents our escape." A profound silence followed this observation, broken only by the persistent whisper of snow against glass and the distant sound of steam escaping from the engine. Each passenger seemed to withdraw into private contemplation, and I found myself studying their faces with new attention, noting the subtle signs of stress and calculation that Poirot had taught me to observe. "Well then," said Poirot with deceptive mildness, adjusting a water glass so that it aligned perfectly with the edge of the table. "Since we find ourselves with time at our disposal and circumstances that demand careful consideration, let us begin with the practical matters. Mr. Ellison, you will oblige me by making a list of all staff positions and movements during the period in question." The suggestion was phrased as a request, but something in Poirot's manner, the precise way he folded his hands, the steady regard of his green eyes, made it clear that it was nothing of the sort. We had entered the realm where Hercule Poirot's little grey cells would sort truth from deception, and where the psychology of guilt would inevitably reveal itself through the smallest inconsistencies in human behavior. The investigation had begun, and in that snow-bound saloon, with the storm raging outside and secrets stirring within, the stage was set for one of Poirot's most intricate cases of deduction. Poirot had transformed the small writing alcove adjacent to the dining saloon into what he termed his bureau temporaire, a temporary office that reflected his obsession with order, even under the most chaotic circumstances. He positioned himself at the narrow writing desk with mathematical precision, adjusting the inkwell until it sat exactly parallel to the edge, arranging his notebook at a perfect right angle, and ensuring that his fountain pen lay aligned with the grain of the wood. The grey light filtering through the snow-laden windows provided adequate illumination, though it cast everything in the peculiar half-twilight that makes secrets seem more plausible and truths more elusive. "We shall proceed methodically," he announced to me in that tone which brooked no argument, establishing first the framework of time and movement, then examining the human elements that give such frameworks their meaning. "A mystery, mon ami, is like a Swiss timepiece. Each component must be understood in relation to all others before the mechanism can be comprehended." The guard's testament, Mr. Ellison, summoned first to this impromptu tribunal, stood with the dignity of a man who had spent 30 years in railway service and understood the importance of precise observation. His weathered hands held his cap with respectful attention, and his responses carried the authority of professional competence. "The timeline, Monsieur Ellison." Poirot began, his pen poised above the pristine page. "From the moment we departed King's Cross until the discovery of Sir Everard's body. Every detail, if you please." "Right then, sir. Normal departure at 11:15. First ticket inspection at 11:30. All passengers accounted for and properly situated. Sir Everard was in his compartment, awake and reading papers from that leather case of his. Seemed quite absorbed in his work, though he nodded politely when I checked his ticket." Poirot made a small notation. "Continue. Second inspection at 1:30. Sir Everard still working, though he'd ordered lunch to be brought to his compartment. Said he didn't wish to be disturbed in the dining saloon. Mr. Dane was hovering about, as secretaries do, waiting for instructions. Third inspection at 3:00, just as the snow began in earnest. Sir Everard's compartment was quiet, blind drawn. I assumed he was resting and didn't disturb him. And the final hours, from 7:00 until the train stopped?" Ellison consulted his pocket watch with the precision of long habit. "Made my evening rounds at 7:30, all quiet in first class. At 8:15, I observed Mr. Dane leaving Sir Everard's compartment with his notebook, quick about it, head down, like a man who'd received sharp words. Around 8:40, Miss Marchmont passed along the corridor toward the ladies' facilities. At 9:05, when we ground to a halt, I made the announcement about delays. That's when Mr. Dane became agitated about his employer not responding. You heard no raised voices? No sounds of disturbance? Quiet as a chapel, sir, though." Ellison hesitated, then continued with the honesty of a man who prided himself on accuracy. "Around 8:30, I did hear what might have been voices from Sir Everard's direction. Muffled, like. Could have been conversation, could have been the gentleman reading aloud to himself. Some business folk do that with important documents." The secretary's distress. Felix Dane entered the alcove with the demeanor of a man who had aged a decade in the space of hours. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of distress. His collar slightly askew, his cuffs bearing ink stains, his complexion an unhealthy shade of grey that spoke of profound shock. "Monsieur Dane," Poirot began with gentle authority, "you were the last person to see Sir Everard alive. I require you to reconstruct those final hours with absolute precision." The young man's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I brought him his evening correspondence at 7:30. Telegrams that had arrived at our last stop, letters forwarded from London. He was in excellent spirits, actually. Mentioned something about a significant acquisition coming to fruition, said it would show those government interferers what real business looks like." Government interferers? Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. There had been some difficulties with his petroleum concessions in the North Sea. Questions raised in Parliament about the bidding process, suggestions of irregularities. Sir Everard was vigorous in his defense of his business practices. Dane swallowed hard. He dictated 2 urgent telegrams, one to his solicitor in London, another to someone he referred to only as "our friend in Whitehall." Then he dismissed me, said he had private correspondence to attend to and wasn't to be disturbed until morning. Yet you returned to his compartment at 8:15? A flush of embarrassment colored Dane's pale cheeks. He rang for me, said he'd changed his mind about one of the telegrams, wanted it recalled if possible. When I entered, he was agitated, more than usual. He was holding a letter, expensive paper, feminine handwriting. He thrust it into his attaché case and snapped the locks shut with considerable force. "Did you observe the contents of this letter?" "No, sir, but Sir Everard's reaction was most unusual. He seemed almost frightened. That's not a word I would normally associate with him, but there's no other way to describe his demeanor." Poirot leaned forward with the intensity of a cat observing a mouse hole. "And when you left him at 8:15? "He locked the door behind me immediately. I heard the bolt slide home. That was his custom when he wished complete privacy for sensitive business matters." The medical opinion. Dr. Hargreaves approached the questioning with professional composure, though I detected an undercurrent of fascination that suggested his scientific mind was engaged by the puzzle before us. "The body's position and condition?" Poirot inquired. "What do they suggest to your experienced eye?" "A sudden collapse, certainly. The rigidity indicates death occurred some time before discovery, perhaps an hour or more. Given the compartment's temperature, no obvious signs of violence, though a complete examination would require proper facilities." The doctor paused thoughtfully. "However, the general disarray of the compartment, the scattered papers, the position of the walking stick, these suggest either a struggle or a frantic search conducted after death." "The walking stick, you observed it particularly?" "Silver-handled, expensive. It had rolled into the corner as if dropped or thrown. Curious, since Sir Everard didn't appear to require assistance with walking." "Perhaps," murmured Poirot. "It served a different purpose entirely." The crucial witness, Miss Beatrice Lyle, entered the alcove with the nervous energy of a sparrow, her knitting clutched like a talisman against the growing atmosphere of suspicion and dread. "Miss Lyle," Poirot began with particular gentleness, recognizing her fragile state, "your compartment adjoins Sir Everard's. You are perhaps our most important witness to the events of last evening." She nodded eagerly, grateful to be of use. "I'm such a light sleeper, Monsieur Poirot. The slightest sound disturbs me. Last evening, around 8 o'clock, I heard voices from Sir Everard's compartment. 2 voices, definitely. One was his, naturally, but the other." She frowned with concentration. "Higher pitched. It could have been a woman or perhaps a young man. They were speaking in low tones initially, but then the conversation became heated." "Heated in what manner?" "Sir Everard's voice rose considerably. I heard him say something about consequences and reputation. The other voice responded, but I couldn't make out the words. Then there was a sound, like something heavy falling or being thrown. After that, complete silence. Poirot's pen moved across the paper with swift precision. At what time did this altercation conclude? Perhaps 20 minutes past 8. Shortly afterward, I heard footsteps in the corridor, someone moving very quietly as if trying not to be noticed. Moving in which direction? Toward the front of the carriage, away from Sir Everard's compartment. The theatrical observer. Mr. Hugo Drake entered with a flourish that seemed somewhat subdued by the gravity of circumstances, though his keen eyes held the alert intelligence of one who made his living by observing human nature. "Mr. Drake," Poirot said, "your profession has trained you to notice details that others might overlook. What did your theatrical instincts observe during the crucial hours?" Drake's usual flamboyance was tempered by genuine seriousness. "Around 8:40, I was in the observation car when I heard a door open and close very softly. Someone who definitely didn't wish to advertise their movements. Then, perhaps 10 minutes later, a curious sound, a faint chiming like crystal touching crystal, delicate but distinct. From which direction? Sir Everard's end of the carriage, certainly. Most peculiar, like someone handling fine glassware with extreme care. The web of suspicion. As each witness departed, I observed Poirot making intricate notations in his notebook, connecting times and movements with the precision of a cartographer mapping unexplored territory. The picture that emerged was one of carefully orchestrated deception, where alibis had been constructed with theatrical precision and motives layered like the geological strata of some ancient cliff face. "You perceive the pattern, Hastings," he murmured, tapping his pen against the desk with metronomic regularity. A man of business, under pressure from government investigation, receives a letter that frightens him. He is visited by someone who argues with him violently. Within hours, he is dead, his private papers scattered, and we are presented with what appears to be natural death in a locked room. The storm continued its assault on the windows, each gust seeming to press closer to our temporary sanctuary. In that confined space, with the weight of suspicion settling over our fellow passengers like a suffocating blanket, I began to understand that we were not merely investigating a death, but unraveling a conspiracy that reached far beyond the confines of our snowbound train. "The little gray cells, they begin to perceive the truth," Poirot continued, his eyes gleaming with the intensity that always preceded his greatest revelations. "But truth, mon ami, is like this storm. It obscures as much as it reveals, until the moment when it clears entirely and shows us the landscape as it truly is." The investigation had begun in earnest, and I sensed that before the storm lifted, we would witness revelations that would shake the very foundations of everything we thought we understood about our fellow passengers. The gray afternoon light, filtered through the relentless curtain of snow, transformed the dining saloon into something resembling a stage set awaiting the final act of a complex drama. Poirot had arranged his remaining interviews with the methodical precision of a master craftsman, each conversation designed to reveal not merely facts, but the psychological landscape that lay beneath the surface of polite society. The storm continued its assault on the windows, each gust seeming to press closer to our temporary sanctuary, while within, the atmosphere grew increasingly charged with unspoken tensions and carefully guarded secrets. The widow's reckoning. Mrs. Constance Whitfield entered the alcove with the bearing of a woman who had commanded both boardrooms and charitable committees with equal authority. Her steel-gray hair was arranged with military precision, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of one who had built considerable influence through shrewd observation of human weakness. Yet beneath her composed exterior, I detected something approaching satisfaction, as if Sir Everard's death had resolved some long-standing grievance. "Mrs. Whitfield," Poirot began with respectful deference, "your position in the observation car afforded you an excellent view of the corridor activities. What did you observe during the crucial hours?" She settled into her chair with deliberate ceremony, her silk dress rustling with what seemed like audible disapproval of the entire situation. Monsieur Poirot, I'm not in the habit of spying on fellow passengers, but one cannot help noticing irregularities in behavior. That young secretary, Mr. Dane, was scurrying about like a frightened mouse, quite agitated, constantly checking his pocket watch. Miss Marchmont appeared unusually restless, pacing the corridor with a tightness about her mouth that suggested considerable inner turmoil. You knew Sir Everard professionally, I believe. Her expression hardened perceptibly. Indeed, Everard Venn possessed the morals of a medieval robber baron clothed in the respectability of modern industry. 3 years ago, he attempted to acquire controlling interest in my late husband's shipping concern through what can only be described as financial terrorism. He failed, but not before causing considerable distress to elderly shareholders who depended upon their dividends for survival. Poirot made a careful notation. Yet you travelled in his company. Lady Isabel's charitable endeavours transcend personal animosity. Besides, her eyes glittered with cold satisfaction. I rather enjoyed observing Everard's discomfort as Parliament's investigation into his North Sea petroleum concessions gathered momentum. Justice, Monsieur Poirot, arrives in many forms, though not always through official channels. You were aware that Sir Everard faced significant legal difficulties. Anyone with connections in Westminster knew his empire was built upon questionable foundations. The parliamentary investigation was merely the beginning. I suspect there were other pressures converging upon him like wolves around a wounded stag. The Soldier's Code. Captain Gerald Kinross approached the interview with military bearing, though I observed a slight tremor in his hands that suggested considerable strain beneath his composed exterior. His mustache bristled with nervous energy as he took his seat with parade-ground precision. "Captain," Poirot observed, "your service record indicates a man of action, accustomed to decisive solutions. How did you view Sir Everard Venn?" The question struck a nerve. Kinross's composure cracked visibly. Venn represented everything I despise about modern commerce, a man who treated human lives as expendable resources in pursuit of profit. During the war, his factories produced defective ammunition that cost the lives of good soldiers. Men I had trained and led into battle died because Everard Venn valued profit margins over quality control. This created considerable animosity. I requested a court of inquiry. Venn's political connections ensured my allegations were quietly buried. He emerged from the war with a knighthood and expanded holdings, while families of dead soldiers received form letters expressing regret for their loss. Poirot leaned forward with increased attention. You saw him as a man who had escaped justice? Until recently, when Parliament's investigation suggested his luck might finally be changing. Last evening, I encountered Mr. Dane in the corridor around 8:15. Poor fellow looked positively green, muttering about his employer's impossible demands and dangerous associations. You passed Sir Everard's compartment during your movements? Indeed. The blind was drawn tight, but I could hear voices, a heated discussion, though I couldn't distinguish words. At the time, I assumed it was business correspondence being dictated, but there was an intensity to the conversation that suggested something more significant. The niece's revelation. Miss Eleanor Marchmont entered with controlled grace that belied the tension in her posture. Her dark eyes held depths of intelligence and determination that spoke of a young woman unimpressed by either wealth or social position. When she spoke, her voice carried quiet authority that commanded immediate attention. Miss Marchmont, Poirot began gently. Several witnesses observed your restless behavior yesterday evening. Mrs. Whitfield mentioned you appeared agitated. Eleanor met his gaze directly. Mrs. Whitfield observes everyone's business with remarkable dedication. I was indeed restless, Monsieur Poirot, because I had received a message from Sir Everard requesting a private meeting at 8 o'clock. He stated it concerned a matter of mutual interest regarding my future prospects. My jaw dropped at this unexpected revelation. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally, a rare display of surprise. "You met with Sir Everard?" "I went to his compartment at precisely 8 o'clock. The door was unlocked, so I entered." She paused, gathering her composure. Sir Everard was there, but he was not alone. Another man was present, standing with his back to me, looking out the window. They were engaged in a violent argument. "You recognize this second man?" "Not immediately. He was of medium height, well-dressed, with graying hair. Sir Everard was shouting about betrayal and professional ruin, while the other man spoke in furious, measured tones about reputation and scandal. I heard him say something about documents that could destroy everything we've built." Poirot's pen moved swiftly across his notebook. "What transpired when Sir Everard noticed your presence?" "He was horrified, absolutely mortified that I had witnessed this confrontation. He practically pushed me from the compartment, saying he would contact me later about our discussion. The door slammed shut, and I heard the bolt slide home immediately." The other man remained inside. "Yes. I was too shaken to linger in the corridor, so I returned directly to my compartment and remained there until the train stopped." The doctor's observations. Dr. Hargreaves returned for additional questioning, his professional demeanor showing signs of strain that suggested personal involvement beyond mere medical interest. "Doctor," Poirot observed, "your examination revealed details that others might have missed. What did your trained eye observe?" Sir Everard showed signs of extreme recent stress, elevated blood pressure, nervous tension, the complexion of a man under severe psychological pressure. His hands bore fresh ink stains, and I found paper fragments beneath his fingernails, suggesting urgent document handling. "You had treated him previously?" The doctor hesitated, then spoke with reluctant honesty. "Sir Everard consulted me privately several months ago for symptoms of acute anxiety, insomnia, digestive difficulties, episodes of rapid heartbeat. He was convinced that enemies were conspiring against him in both business and government circles." "He mentioned specific threats?" "Anonymous letters suggesting knowledge of irregular business practices. He was particularly concerned about maintaining the appearance of robust health during the parliamentary investigation, fearing that any sign of weakness would be exploited by his enemies." The web of contradictions. As the interviews concluded, Poirot's notebook had filled with an increasingly complex web of times, movements, and conflicting testimonies. He studied his notes with the intensity of a cartographer mapping uncharted territory. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, tapping his pen against the desk with metronomic precision, "the curious matter of chronology. Mr. Dane states he was dismissed from Sir Everard's compartment at 8:15, with the door locked behind him. Miss Lyle heard an argument concluding around 8:20, yet Miss Marchmont claims she was ejected at 8 o'clock, also with the door locked immediately afterward. I studied his careful timeline. Someone must be mistaken about the time. Or Poirot's eyes gleamed with the intensity that always preceded his most brilliant deductions. Someone is deliberately constructing a false sequence of events. Consider also the mysterious second man whom Miss Marchmont observed, a figure who appears in no other testimony, yet whose presence would explain the heated argument Miss Lyle overheard. He turned to a fresh page in his notebook. "We have established that Sir Everard was under extreme pressure from multiple sources. Government investigation, financial enemies, anonymous threats. We know he received a letter yesterday that frightened him considerably. We know he argued violently with someone in his compartment, yet we are asked to believe his death was natural, occurring in a locked room with no evidence of foul play. The storm continued its relentless assault on the windows, and I found myself studying the faces of our fellow passengers with new understanding. Each had presented compelling reasons to despise Sir Everard Venn, yet each maintained the fiction of innocence. The pattern was becoming clear, too clear perhaps, for comfort. The little grey cells," Poirot continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They perceive a most elaborate deception. Someone among our companions possesses both the intelligence to orchestrate this mystery and the desperation to carry it through to its fatal conclusion. Before this storm lifts, mon ami, we shall discover not merely who killed Sir Everard Venn, but why they felt compelled to create such an intricate web of misdirection. The investigation had taken a decidedly more complex turn, with contradictory testimonies and a mysterious figure whose very existence called into question everything we thought we understood about the events of the previous evening. In that snow-bound saloon, with suspicion hanging over our fellow passengers like a suffocating shroud, I sensed that the most dangerous revelation still lay ahead of us. The grey afternoon light had deepened to an ominous twilight when Lady Isabel, demonstrating the decisive authority that had made her a formidable presence in London society, addressed the assembled passengers with quiet command. The dining saloon had become our temporary courtroom, its mahogany paneling and crystal fixtures bearing witness to accusations and denials that grew more heated with each passing hour. "We cannot continue in this atmosphere of suspicion and speculation," she declared, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "For the safety and peace of mind of everyone present, I propose we conduct a systematic examination of all personal effects and compartments. If there is evidence to be found, let us find it openly and honestly." The suggestion sent a visible tremor through the assembled group. Mrs. Whitfield straightened with the expression of one who had long advocated such decisive action, while Captain Kinross nodded with military approval. Dr. Hargreaves appeared resigned but cooperative, though I noticed his hands betraying slight nervousness as he adjusted his cufflinks. Only Felix Dane seemed truly stricken, his complexion progressing from pale to an alarming shade of grey. The methodical search. Poirot positioned himself where he could observe without appearing to dominate, his keen eyes noting every reaction, every subtle shift in posture that might betray guilt or fear. "A most sensible proposal, Lady Isabel," he said with quiet approval. "In circumstances such as these, transparency serves justice better than privacy serves comfort." Captain Kinross, with characteristic military efficiency, assumed command of the practical arrangements. "We shall proceed systematically, beginning with those who had the most direct contact with the deceased. Mr. Dane, if you would be so good as to present your personal effects for examination." The young secretary's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish struggling for air. For a moment, he seemed about to protest. Then, as if some internal resolve finally snapped, he rose with jerky, uncoordinated movements and fetched his small leather valise from his compartment. The contents, when spread upon the polished dining table, presented a portrait of meticulous organization that spoke to a mind accustomed to order and precision. Captain Kinross arranged each item with military attention to detail. Shirts folded with geometric perfection, a well-worn French dictionary, sheaves of carbon copies arranged in chronological order, 2 fountain pens with their accompanying repair kit, a pocket diary with evening appointments underlined in red ink, and finally, a flat grey envelope bound with black ribbon. "The envelope, if you please," Lady Isabel requested with gentle but unmistakable authority. Felix's hands trembled as he struggled with the ribbon. "I must protest, these are private papers entrusted to my care by Sir Everard. Professional confidentiality demands—" "Professional confidentiality," Mrs. Whitfield interrupted with acid sweetness, "becomes rather academic when the professional in question lies dead in his compartment with his private papers scattered like autumn leaves. The damning evidence." The envelope yielded its secrets reluctantly. Within lay a smaller envelope of heavy cream paper, its wax seal broken, bearing an elegant monogram beneath a coronet. The handwriting was bold and unmistakably feminine, and as the air touched the paper, a faint scent of violets rose like a ghostly accusation. Captain Kinross extracted the letter with careful precision, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read. The colour climbed into his cheeks before he passed the document to Lady Isabel, who scanned it with the rapid efficiency of one accustomed to managing correspondence and crises with equal facility. "It is signed with initials only," she announced, her voice carefully controlled. "E.M." All eyes turned inevitably toward Miss Eleanor Marchmont, who met their collective gaze with unflinching composure. "I did not write to Sir Everard," she stated quietly, her voice carrying the ring of absolute truth. Felix found his voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. The letter threatened him, not with exposure, but with withdrawal of support. Sir Everard had many correspondents, particularly ladies who admired his success in business. This particular correspondent was refusing to provide assistance he had apparently requested. "Assistance of what nature?" Dr. Hargreaves inquired with professional sharpness. He did not confide the details, Felix replied, his eyes flickering with what might have been evasion or genuine ignorance. But Captain Kinross's methodical search had uncovered something far more damaging. His hand emerged from the valise clutching a brass key, its surface gleaming with the brightness of recent manufacture, its notches sharp and precise. The mechanical revelation. Mr. Ellison, summoned to examine this discovery, took the key with the reverence of one handling evidence in a capital case. The assembled passengers held their collective breath as he departed for Sir Everard's compartment, returning moments later with the grim satisfaction of confirmation. "It opens Sir Everard's door perfectly, sir," he reported to Captain Kinross. "Not the bolt, naturally, but the lock mechanism turns as smoothly as if it were the original." The implications rippled through the saloon like shock waves from an explosion. Here was tangible evidence of premeditation, a duplicate key that would allow silent entry into what should have been a private sanctuary. But Captain Kinross was not finished. From the depths of the repair kit, he extracted a coil of thin silk cord to which had been attached a bent hatpin with surgical precision. "This device," he announced with the satisfaction of a prosecutor presenting his master stroke, "will serve, with modest ingenuity, to manipulate a door bolt from the outside. I have observed similar field expedients during my service in India. The hatpin catches the bolt mechanism, the cord provides the necessary leverage." To demonstrate his theory, he approached the saloon's sideboard and proceeded to manipulate its drawer lock with distressing success, the mechanism yielding to his improvised tool with mechanical precision. The false accusation. "You're completely mad," Felix whispered, his voice breaking with desperation. I could never. "Your diary," Mrs. Whitfield observed with the relentless logic of a prosecuting attorney, "contains an entry for 8:15. Recall telegram. Yet you testified that Sir Everard dismissed you at that time. Which version represents the truth?" Felix buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or laughter. "I went back," he admitted hoarsely. "Sir Everard rang for me. He often changed his mind about correspondence. When I arrived, the door was unlocked, and I found—" His voice failed entirely. "Found what?" Captain Kinross pressed with military insistence. "He was on the floor, already dead. The attaché case was open, papers scattered everywhere. I was terrified. I thought I would be blamed. So I took the letter, thinking to protect whoever had written it from scandal. I know it was wrong, but I never killed him. I swear by everything sacred, I am not capable of such an act." Poirot's intervention. The tide of conviction that had risen so swiftly around Felix Dane might have swept him toward inevitable condemnation, but Poirot's voice cut through the mounting certainty like a blade through silk. "Non," he said quietly, the single word carrying more authority than a shouted protest. "This construction is most elegant, most satisfying to our desire for simple solutions. But it rests upon a fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology." Captain Kinross bristled with military indignation. "The evidence speaks for itself, Monsieur Poirot. Motive, means, opportunity. all clearly established. The evidence, Poirot replied with gentle firmness, has been arranged with theatrical precision by someone who understands how logical minds reach conclusions. But observe, if you please, the psychological impossibility of your theory. He gestured toward Felix's meticulously organized possessions, still arranged with geometric precision upon the table. When a timid man commits murder, does he afterward sit down to tie neat knots in silk cord? Does he carefully arrange physical evidence to create elaborate puzzles for investigators? Mais non. He panics, he flees, he destroys evidence in clumsy haste. Dr. Hargreaves leaned forward with professional interest. You're suggesting the evidence was planted? I suggest that someone with intimate knowledge of Mr. Dane's habits and access to his possessions has created a most convincing tableau of guilt. The duplicate key. What secretary does not possess such a thing when his employer habitually locks himself away and must sometimes be reached in emergencies? The silk cord and hat pin. What office worker does not maintain tools for repairing typewriter ribbons and adjusting delicate mechanisms? The physical evidence. Rising from his chair with decisive movement, Poirot approached the evidence table and began his own systematic examination. From his waistcoat pocket appeared his magnifying glass, and he subjected each item to scrutiny that bordered on the microscopic. The walking stick found in Sir Everard's compartment, he announced, lifting the silver-handled implement with careful precision. Dr. Hargreaves noted that the deceased required no assistance with mobility, yet here we find scratches near the base of the handle, fresh marks consistent with metallic contact under pressure. He moved to examine the scattered contents of Sir Everard's attaché case, noting the quality of paper, the sequence of documents, the careful way certain items had been arranged to suggest hasty searching while others remained in perfect order. Most interesting is this fragment, he continued, producing a small translucent envelope containing a torn piece of heavy paper. Found near the body, bearing traces of distinctive blue ink and a peculiar scent that suggests expensive stationery rather than common correspondence. The timeline. Paradox. Returning to his notebook, Poirot began a systematic reconstruction that revealed the fundamental impossibility of the accepted sequence of events. Let us examine the testimonies with mathematical precision. Miss Marchmont states she was ejected from Sir Everard's compartment at 8 o'clock, the door immediately locked behind her. Mr. Dane claims dismissal at 8:15, also with immediate locking. Miss Lyle heard an argument concluding at 8:20, followed by footsteps moving away from the compartment. He looked up from his notes with the expression of a mathematics professor confronting a particularly elegant proof. These testimonies cannot all be accurate. Either our timepieces are remarkably unreliable, or someone has constructed a deliberate fiction designed to obscure the true sequence of events. The implications settled over the assembled passengers like a suffocating blanket. If the timeline was fabricated, then the entire foundation of their understanding crumbled, leaving them adrift in a sea of uncertainty where any of them might be guilty of the most elaborate deception. The escalation. As if summoned by the growing tension, Mr. Ellison appeared in the saloon doorway, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had discovered something that disturbed him profoundly. "Begging your pardon, ladies and gentlemen," he announced with the careful courtesy that railway employees maintain even in extremity, "but I'm afraid I must report a most serious development. During my routine inspection of the carriages, I discovered that someone has deliberately tampered with our telegraph apparatus. The wires have been cut with precision. This was no accident of weather or mechanical failure." A collective gasp arose from the assembled passengers, followed by the profound silence of minds grappling with the implications of this revelation. Mrs. Whitfield's face went white as parchment, while Miss Lyle's knitting needles fell from nerveless fingers. "What does this mean?" whispered Dr. Hargreaves, though his professional composure suggested he already understood the answer. Poirot's expression remained composed, but I detected that familiar glitter in his eyes that spoke of pieces falling into place within the complex mechanism of his mind. It means, mesdames et messieurs, that we are not merely snowbound by the vagaries of English weather. We have been deliberately isolated by someone who requires time to perfect their deception or eliminate inconvenient witnesses. The gathering storm. The storm continued its relentless assault on the windows, but now each gust seemed less like natural fury and more like the breathing of some malevolent presence that had trapped them all in this confined space with a killer whose identity remained hidden behind layers of misdirection and carefully constructed alibis. Felix Dane sat in stunned silence, reprieved from immediate condemnation, but still bearing the weight of circumstantial evidence that painted him as the obvious suspect. Around him, the other passengers shifted uncomfortably, each now forced to confront the possibility that their fellow travelers included someone capable of murder and elaborate deception. "The little grey cells," Poirot murmured, adjusting a water glass with characteristic precision. "They begin to perceive the true pattern beneath this carefully woven tapestry of lies. Someone among us possesses not only the intelligence to orchestrate such an elaborate mystery, but the desperation to see it through to whatever conclusion they deem necessary." In that snowbound saloon, with the weight of suspicion hanging over every passenger and the knowledge that their isolation was no accident, I understood that we had moved beyond simple investigation into something far more dangerous. A deadly game where the stakes were not merely justice, but the very survival of everyone trapped within the confines of the Northern Highland Express. The false lead had been presented and dismissed, but in its place rose something far more sinister, the certainty that their tormentor walked among them, hidden behind a mask of respectability and concern, waiting for the perfect moment to complete whatever dark design had begun with Sir Everard Venn's carefully orchestrated death. The grey afternoon light had deepened to an ominous twilight, transforming the dining saloon into something resembling a stage awaiting the final act of an elaborate psychological drama. The storm's relentless assault on the windows seemed to press closer with each gust, as if the very elements sought entry to witness the unfolding confrontation between Hercule Poirot's legendary powers of deduction and a mind capable of orchestrating murder with theatrical precision. Poirot moved through this charged atmosphere with the deliberate grace of a master craftsman, his keen eyes noting every subtle shift in posture, every nervous gesture that might betray the guilt festering beneath polite facades. The revelation of the deliberately severed telegraph wires had transformed their situation from unfortunate accident to calculated imprisonment, and this knowledge hung over the assembled passengers like a suffocating shroud. The master's gambit. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot announced, positioning himself where he could observe every face simultaneously, "we find ourselves participants in a most elaborate psychological experiment. Someone among us has not merely committed murder, but has orchestrated our isolation with the precision of a theatrical director arranging his stage." He paused, allowing the weight of this observation to settle over his audience like dust motes in failing light. Mrs. Whitfield straightened with the indignation of one unused to being subjected to analysis, while Captain Kinross's military bearing became more pronounced, as if preparing for battle. Dr. Hargreaves maintained his professional composure, though I detected an undercurrent of fascination that suggested his scientific mind was engaged by the puzzle before us. "The cutting of the telegraph wires," Poirot continued with deceptive mildness, "tells us two things of paramount importance. First, our antagonist requires time to perfect their deception or eliminate inconvenient witnesses. Second, they possess the confidence of someone who believes their plan to be foolproof." Moving with characteristic precision, Poirot approached the evidence table and began rearranging Sir Everard's scattered papers with mathematical exactitude. But confidence, mes amis, is often the fatal flaw in otherwise perfect crimes. It leads to small vanities, tiny demonstrations of cleverness that ultimately betray their author. The psychological pressure, Felix Dane, still bearing the weight of circumstantial evidence despite his reprieve, watched with growing horror as Poirot began his systematic psychological assault. "If the evidence against me was planted," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "then someone else, someone in this very room—" "Precisely, mon ami," Poirot confirmed with grim satisfaction. "Someone who understood your habits sufficiently well to create convincing false evidence. Someone who possessed both the intelligence to orchestrate this elaborate deception and the intimate knowledge necessary to manipulate your personal effects." He turned his attention to Captain Kinross, whose hands now showed a slight tremor despite his rigid military posture. "Captain, your service record indicates a man of decisive action, accustomed to achieving objectives through strategic deception. The ability to create false evidence, to manipulate circumstances, to eliminate obstacles, these are skills valued in both warfare and criminal enterprise." The accusation, though couched in polite language, struck its target with devastating precision. Kinross's composure cracked visibly. "Are you suggesting that my service to the Crown somehow qualifies me for murder? I suggest that your personal grievances against Sir Everard ran deeper than professional disappointment. The defective ammunition that cost soldiers' lives was your own brother, perhaps, among the casualties." The question landed like a physical blow. Kinross's face went white, then flushed with barely controlled emotion. "Lieutenant William Kinross died at Passchendaele because Everard Venn's factories delivered shells that failed to explode. My younger brother, the finest man I ever knew, killed by corporate greed masquerading as patriotic duty. The web of secrets. Mrs. Whitfield, who had maintained her position as moral arbiter throughout the proceedings, now found herself subjected to Poirot's penetrating analysis. Mrs. Whitfield," he continued with relentless courtesy, "your opposition to Sir Everard's business practices was well established, but I suspect your knowledge of his vulnerabilities extended beyond public information." Her steel-grey composure wavered perceptibly. "I have no idea what you're suggesting. The anonymous letters that tormented Sir Everard. They required intimate knowledge of his private dealings, access to confidential information, and the sophisticated understanding of psychological pressure that comes only with extensive experience in managing both people and secrets." Miss Eleanor Marchmont, who had maintained dignified composure throughout the proceedings, now spoke with quiet intensity. "If someone among us possessed such knowledge, and if Sir Everard's death was indeed orchestrated rather than natural, then what prevents this individual from striking again to protect their secret?" The question sent a visible tremor through the assembled group. Dr. Hargreaves' professional mask slipped fractionally, while Mr. Drake's usual theatrical confidence seemed to desert him entirely. The sealed verdict. Moving with deliberate ceremony, Poirot approached the sideboard and placed a single sealed envelope upon its polished surface. He pressed the wax with his signet ring and held it to the light with theatrical precision. "Within this envelope," he announced conversationally, "I have written a name. If I am correct, the person who bears this name has much to fear before morning. If I am mistaken, you will have the satisfaction of witnessing Hercule Poirot's fallibility. A rare entertainment indeed." He gestured to Mr. Ellison, who had appeared as if summoned by the gravity of the moment. "Monsieur Ellison, be so good as to secure this envelope in your safe. It shall remain there until circumstances compel its opening." The guard obeyed with the reverence of one handling evidence in a capital case, and the safe door closed with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire carriage. The effect was immediate and profound, a collective intake of breath that spoke of minds grappling with the implications of this dramatic gesture. The final stratagem. "One additional precaution," Poirot continued, his voice carrying that particular quality of gentle authority that commanded attention without demanding it. "No one is to move about the train alone. You will go in pairs, Mr. Drake with Miss Lyle, Captain Kinross with Mrs. Whitfield, Dr. Hargreaves with Miss Marchmont. Mr. Ellison will accompany Lady Isabel, and Hastings will remain with me." Protests began immediately, but Poirot silenced them with a raised hand. "It is a kindness, I assure you. Murderers dislike pairs. They find them discouraging to enterprise." As the reluctant partnerships formed, I observed Poirot studying each interaction with the intensity of a naturalist observing rare specimens. Who offered comfort? Who solicited it? Who seemed relieved by the arrangement, and who watched the guard's office with barely concealed hunger? The waiting game. When the saloon had emptied and we found ourselves alone, Poirot settled into his chair with the satisfaction of a chess master who had successfully maneuvered his opponent into an impossible position. "You truly wrote a name?" I asked, unable to suppress my curiosity. He smiled with that familiar expression of supreme confidence. "But yes, mon ami, a name. Whether it is the correct name, that is the delicious uncertainty that will drive our antagonist to reveal themselves." The storm continued its assault on the windows, each gust seeming to whisper secrets that only Poirot could interpret. In that confined space, with the weight of his sealed prediction lying secure in the guard's safe, I understood that we had moved beyond simple investigation into something far more dangerous. A psychological duel where the stakes were not merely justice, but the very survival of everyone trapped within the Northern Highland Express. "Now," Poirot murmured, his eyes half closed in concentration, "we shall discover whether pride or fear proves the stronger motivator. The murderer has created an elaborate fiction, but fiction, no matter how carefully constructed, cannot withstand the pressure of psychological truth. Before this night is over, someone will attempt to correct what they perceive as a fatal error in their perfect plan." He opened his eyes and fixed me with that familiar glitter that always preceded his most brilliant revelations. "And when they do, Hastings, we shall be ready to observe not merely what they do, but why they feel compelled to do it. For in that moment of compulsion, the mask will slip, and we shall see the true face of our adversary." The psychological game had reached its crescendo, and in the mounting tension that filled the air like electricity before a thunderstorm, I sensed that the most dangerous revelations still lay ahead of us. Someone among our companions was about to be forced into the open, and when that moment arrived, the consequences would prove more devastating than any of us had dared imagine. The enforced quiet of the midnight hours brought with it an atmosphere of barely contained tension, as if the very air within our snowbound sanctuary had grown thick with unspoken fears and carefully guarded secrets. Poirot maintained his characteristic vigil in the dining saloon, positioned where he could observe the subtle movements and sounds that others might dismiss as the natural settling of a train under winter's assault. His eyes remained closed, but I'd learned to recognize the quality of attention that marked his most intense periods of deduction, when his legendary little gray cells worked with the precision of a master, craftsman assembling the components of an intricate timepiece. The midnight gambit. At precisely 27 minutes past midnight, the delicate sound that Mr. Drake had described earlier, that crystalline chiming like fine glass, touching glass, drifted through the corridor with unmistakable clarity. This time, however, it was not distant but immediate, emanating from somewhere very close to our position. Poirot's eyes opened with the swiftness of a cat detecting movement, and he held up one finger in a gesture that commanded absolute silence. The sound came again, accompanied by the softest possible footsteps moving with extraordinary care along the carpeted corridor. Someone was moving through our confined world with the deliberate precision of one who understood that discovery would mean catastrophe. "Voilà," Poirot whispered with grim satisfaction. "Our antagonist grows desperate. The sealed envelope has achieved precisely the effect I intended. It has forced them into premature action when they would have preferred to remain hidden." We waited in the darkness, every sense straining to interpret the subtle symphony of sounds that filtered through the walls of our temporary prison. The careful click of a door latch, the the whisper of fabric against wood, the faint scrape of metal against metal. Each sound painted a picture of someone engaged in activities that could not bear the scrutiny of daylight. The poisoner's art. The cry that shattered the midnight stillness was not the dramatic scream one might expect in a sensational novel, but something far more chilling, a soft gasp of surprise followed by the unmistakable sound of someone collapsing. We found Miss Beatrice Lyle in the corridor outside the ladies' retiring room, conscious but trembling violently, her knitting scattered across the polished floor like the remnants of some domestic catastrophe. Dr. Hargreaves arrived with professional swiftness, his examination revealing what his trained senses had immediately suspected. "Not a simple faint," he announced with quiet authority. "There are signs of narcotic influence. The pulse is regular but slowed, breathing shallow. A sweetish taint to the breath suggests chloral, administered in a carefully measured dose." Miss Lyle's account, delivered in fragmented whispers, painted a picture of calculated malice disguised as kindness. She had been offered tea by Mr. Drake, who had fetched it from the pantry trolley with every appearance of gallant concern for her comfort. The conversation had been pleasant, unremarkable, until she rose to visit the retiring room and found herself overcome by a floating, dreamlike sensation that robbed her of strength and consciousness. The physical evidence. Poirot's examination of the tea service revealed the elegant simplicity of the poisoner's method. The fine cut-glass milk jug sat innocently among the other implements, but his trained eye detected what others had missed. Using the sugar tongs with delicate precision, he extracted from their gripping surfaces a translucent scale no larger than a pinhead, glittering with the telltale sheen of broken glass. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, holding the fragment to the lamplight. A small vial, crushed within the tongs and mixed with the milk. The chiming sound we heard, not mere crystal touching crystal, but the deliberate breaking of glass to release its contents. Most ingenious, and requiring both steady nerves and considerable knowledge of chemistry. The method spoke to a mind that valued precision over brutality, calculation over passion. This was not the work of someone driven by sudden rage, but of an individual who planned each move with the care of a chess master contemplating the endgame. The revelation of false evidence. Mr. Ellison, summoned to provide technical expertise, delivered information that transformed our understanding of the case entirely. His examination of Sir Everard's compartment door revealed a crucial detail that had been overlooked in the earlier excitement. "The bolt mechanism, sir," he explained with the authority of 30 years' railway experience, "is a box bolt, side-mounted within the compartment, with a hooked tongue that drops into a protected pocket. That hat-pin contraption found in Mr. Dane's effects, begging your pardon, sir, it might scratch the varnish, but it couldn't lift that tongue. Not from the outside, not with all the silk cord in London." The implications rippled through our small gathering like shock waves from an explosion. The elaborate evidence that had seemed to condemn Felix Dane was not merely circumstantial. It was physically impossible. Someone had planted those items with the deliberate intention of creating a convincing, but ultimately false, solution to the mystery. The psychological portrait. "We are dealing with a mind of considerable sophistication," Poirot observed, his voice carrying that particular quality of respectful acknowledgement that he reserved for worthy adversaries. "Someone who understands not merely the mechanics of murder, but the psychology of investigation. They anticipated that we would search for means and opportunity, so they provided both in abundance, but attached to an innocent man." He moved to the window, gazing out at the storm with the expression of a general contemplating an enemy's strategy. The poisoning of Miss Lyle was not intended to kill. The dose was carefully calculated to incapacitate rather than eliminate. This tells us that our antagonist feared her testimony more than her existence. What had she observed that posed such a threat to their carefully constructed fiction? The answer came from Miss Lyle herself, speaking in a voice still weak from her ordeal. "I keep detailed notes," she admitted with embarrassed pride. "Times, observations, small details that others might forget. Last evening, I recorded everything I heard from Sir Everard's compartment. The voices, the timing, the sequence of events. I thought it might prove helpful if anyone required precise testimony." The tightening web. The revelation that Miss Lyle possessed written documentation of the crucial period sent a visible tremor through our assembled suspects. Here was evidence that could not be dismissed as faulty memory or confused perception. A contemporary record compiled by an observant witness with no apparent motive for deception. "The murderer's greatest fear," Poirot continued with quiet intensity, "is not spoken testimony, which can be challenged and contradicted, but written evidence, which carries the weight of documented truth. They have been forced to act not once, but twice tonight, first to silence a witness, then to eliminate evidence that threatens their alibi." He turned from the window, his keen eyes moving systematically from face to face, noting the subtle signs of stress and calculation that his experience had taught him to recognize. But in acting, they have revealed themselves. Each desperate measure has provided us with additional information about their psychology, their methods, and their growing desperation. The pattern emerges. As the grey dawn light began to filter through the snow-laden windows, Poirot assembled the fragments of evidence with the precision of a master craftsman. The chiming sound that had been heard at crucial moments. The sophisticated knowledge of chemistry required for the poisoning. The intimate understanding of railway mechanisms needed to plant false evidence. The psychological insight necessary to anticipate and manipulate the investigation. Our antagonist possesses a combination of technical knowledge, psychological sophistication, and desperate motivation, he concluded. They have demonstrated familiarity with both the mechanical aspects of the crime scene and the human elements of the investigation. Most significantly, they have shown themselves willing to escalate from murder to attempted poisoning when their original plan was threatened. The storm continued its relentless assault on our temporary prison, but I sensed that nature's fury was nothing compared to the human tempest that was building toward its inevitable climax. Someone among our fellow passengers had revealed themselves through their very attempts at concealment, and Poirot's legendary powers of deduction had begun to pierce the elaborate veil of misdirection they had constructed. The approaching crisis. The endgame approaches, Poirot murmured, adjusting a teacup with characteristic precision until it aligned perfectly with the edge of the table. Our murderer has been forced into increasingly desperate measures, each action revealing more about their true nature. They began with elaborate planning and careful misdirection, but desperation has made them careless. The little grey cells, they perceive the pattern now, not merely what was done, but why it was necessary to do it. In that confined space, with the weight of revelation pressing in from all sides, I understood that we had moved beyond simple investigation into something far more dangerous. The psychological game had reached its crescendo, and before the storm lifted, we would witness the final confrontation between Hercule Poirot's methodical brilliance and a mind that had thought itself capable of the perfect crime. The night had brought us closer to the truth, but it had also demonstrated that our antagonist was prepared to go to any length to protect their secret. As the grey dawn struggled through the storm clouds, I sensed that the most dangerous revelations still lay ahead of us, waiting to be unveiled in the harsh light of Poirot's inexorable logic. The grey dawn light, filtering through the relentless curtain of snow, revealed faces etched with exhaustion and barely concealed desperation. The night's revelations had stripped away the comfortable veneer of civilized behavior, exposing the raw nerves and calculated deceptions that festered beneath polite society's carefully maintained facade. Poirot sat at his makeshift desk with mathematical precision, his notebook open to pages covered with diagrams, timelines, and observations that formed an intricate map of human psychology under extreme pressure. The mechanical revelation. "Hastings," Poirot murmured, his voice carrying that particular quality of suppressed excitement that always preceded his most brilliant deductions. "Observe this most curious matter of Sir Everard's walking stick. Dr. Hargreaves noted correctly that the deceased required no assistance with mobility, yet here we find an implement bearing fresh scratches near the silver handle. Marks that tell a most interesting story." He rose from his chair and approached the evidence table with ceremonial deliberation. Using his magnifying glass with the intensity of a scientist examining rare specimens, he traced the scratch patterns with one precisely manicured finger. The assembled passengers watched with growing unease as he revealed details that had escaped their earlier notice. "See here," he continued, indicating parallel grooves along the handle's surface. "Marks consistent with metallic contact under considerable pressure. But observe also this delicate scoring near the head of the handle, as if something small and crystalline had struck it with deliberate force." Mr. Ellison, summoned to provide his professional expertise, examined the walking stick with the thoroughness of one whose livelihood depended upon understanding mechanical systems. "Curious thing, sir," he reported with the authority of 3 decades railway experience. "These marks suggest the stick was used as a lever or prying tool, but for what purpose, I couldn't say." The timeline. Paradox. Poirot returned to his notebook, his pen moving across the page with swift precision as he reconstructed the evening's events with mathematical exactitude. "Let us examine the testimonies with absolute precision, mes amis. Miss Marchmont states she entered Sir Everard's compartment at 8 o'clock, witnessing an argument between him and an unidentified second man. She was ejected, and the door was immediately bolted behind her." He looked up from his notes, his keen eyes noting every subtle reaction among the assembled group. Yet Mr. Dane claims dismissal at 8:15, also with the door immediately locked. Miss Lyle heard an argument concluding at 8:20, followed by footsteps moving away from the compartment. These testimonies cannot all be accurate. Either our timepieces are remarkably unreliable, or someone has constructed a deliberate fiction. The implications settled over the passengers like a suffocating blanket. Felix Dane's complexion progressed from pale to an alarming shade of grey, while Captain Kinross's military bearing became more rigid with each revelation. The chemical evidence. Moving to the pantry with deliberate ceremony, Poirot conducted his examination of the tea service with forensic precision. The cut-glass milk jug, seemingly innocent among the other implements, yielded secrets that spoke to a mind of considerable sophistication. "Observe, if you please," he announced, holding the jug's spout to the grey light filtering through the windows. "Here, where the glass curves most gracefully, we find traces of a most interesting combination. The faint, opalescent residue speaks of chloral hydrate, a sleeping draught favored by those who understand chemistry. But note also this delicate perfume that lingers despite the washing." He held the spout beneath my nose, and I detected that same elusive scent that had haunted the investigation. Sweet violets with an underlying medicinal sharpness that pinched the sinuses. "Violets to mask the chloral," Poirot continued with quiet satisfaction. "A chemist's trick, requiring both knowledge and access to specialized materials. One does not simply purchase such combinations at the village pharmacy." The paper fragment. From his waistcoat pocket, Poirot produced a small envelope containing the torn fragment of expensive stationery found near Sir Everard's body. Under his magnifying glass, the paper revealed characteristics that had escaped casual observation. "Heavy stock, bearing a distinctive watermark," he announced with growing confidence. "The blue ink shows properties consistent with a particular type of fountain pen, one that requires specialized cartridges available only through select suppliers. Most significantly, this fragment bears the same violet scent that has haunted our investigation from the beginning. He held up the empty cream-colored envelope that had been discovered. In Felix Dane's possession, the one bearing elegant monogram and feminine handwriting. The paper quality, the distinctive ink, the violet perfume, all identical. This fragment, mes amis, is a piece of the letter that so agitated Sir Everard in his final hours. The psychological portrait. Dr. Hargreaves, his professional composure showing increasing strain, stepped forward with reluctant fascination. The technical knowledge required for such methods suggests someone with considerable scientific training. The precise dosage of chloral, the chemical masking with perfume, the sophisticated understanding of human psychology. These point to a mind that values intellectual superiority over brute force. Precisely, Doctor, Poirot confirmed with respectful acknowledgement. We are dealing with someone who finds satisfaction in demonstrating superior intelligence. The elaborate false evidence, the sophisticated poisoning method, the careful manipulation of testimonies, all speak to a personality that cannot resist adding unnecessary complications to prove their cleverness. The hidden clue revealed. Moving with theatrical precision, Poirot approached the window where the storm continued its relentless assault. He examined the brass fittings with his characteristic attention to detail, noting elements that others had dismissed as insignificant. The walking stick served a most specific purpose, he announced with quiet triumph. Not as a weapon, but as a tool. Observe the scratch patterns once more. They correspond precisely to the spacing of these window frame brackets. Someone used Sir Everard's own walking stick to manipulate the window mechanism, creating an alternative means of entry that would leave the door genuinely locked from within. The revelation struck the assembled group with the force of a physical blow. Here was the solution to the locked room mystery. Not elaborate mechanical devices or impossible alibis, but simple ingenuity applied with deadly precision. The tightening web. The murderer possessed intimate knowledge of Sir Everard's habits and possessions. Poirot continued with relentless logic. They knew about the walking stick, understood the window mechanism, had access to both the victim's compartment and his private correspondence. Most significantly, they possessed the chemical knowledge necessary for the sophisticated poisoning of Miss Lyle. He paused, allowing the weight of his observations to settle over the group like dust motes in failing light. Someone among us has demonstrated not merely the means and opportunity for murder, but the specialized knowledge and desperate motivation that would compel them to risk everything on such an elaborate deception. The final pressure. The storm continued its assault on the windows, but I sensed that nature's fury was nothing compared to the human tempest building toward its inevitable climax. Poirot had identified the crucial elements that would unravel the entire conspiracy, and his legendary powers of deduction were preparing to expose not merely a murderer, but a web of secrets that threatened to destroy everyone it touched. "The little gray cells," he murmured, adjusting his cufflinks with characteristic precision. They perceive the final pattern now, not merely who committed this crime, but why they felt compelled to construct such an elaborate fiction to conceal their guilt. The desperation that drove them to murder has also driven them to increasingly reckless attempts at misdirection. In that confined space, with the weight of revelation pressing in from all sides, I understood that we had reached the crucial moment where all of Poirot's careful observations would converge into irrefutable truth. The hidden clue had been revealed, and with it, the key to understanding not merely a single murder, but an entire conspiracy that had ensnared everyone aboard the Northern Highland Express. The endgame was approaching, and as Poirot's eyes swept across the assembled faces, noting every subtle sign of guilt, fear, and desperate calculation, I knew that the final confrontation would prove more devastating than any of us had dared imagine. Someone among our fellow passengers was about to be exposed not merely as a murderer, but as the architect of an elaborate deception that had turned our isolated sanctuary into a stage for the most complex psychological drama of Poirot's distinguished career. The grey morning light, struggling through the storm's relentless curtain, transformed the dining saloon into something resembling a courtroom awaiting final judgment. The snow had begun to show signs of abating, with occasional glimpses of pale sky promising the eventual arrival of rescue. But within our confined sanctuary, the atmosphere remained charged with the electric tension that precedes revelation. Poirot had arranged the scene with theatrical precision. Chairs drawn into a perfect semicircle, the mahogany table cleared and transformed into a stage where the accumulated evidence lay displayed like exhibits in some elaborate inquest. The final assembly. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot announced, positioning himself where he could observe every face simultaneously. "We have reached the moment of reckoning. The storm that has imprisoned us has also provided the perfect laboratory for observing human nature under extreme pressure. What began as an apparent natural death has revealed itself to be murder disguised with considerable sophistication by someone who understood both the mechanics of deception and the psychology of investigation." Lady Isabel, maintaining her composed authority despite the mounting tension, gestured toward the assembled group with quiet command. "Monsieur Poirot, we place ourselves entirely at your disposal. Let truth emerge, whatever the consequences may be." The passengers arranged themselves with the reluctant precision of actors taking their places for a final performance. Mrs. Whitfield sat with military erectness, though I detected a subtle tremor in her carefully gloved hands. Captain Kinross maintained his soldierly bearing, but his eyes held the wariness of a man who had seen too many battles to underestimate any enemy. Felix Dane appeared almost translucent with relief at his reprieve, yet still bore the haunted expression of one who had glimpsed the scaffold. Miss Eleanor Marchmont watched with intelligent intensity, while Mr. Drake's usual theatrical confidence seemed to have deserted him entirely. Dr. Hargreaves sat with professional composure, though his gaze remained fixed on Poirot with what might have been fascination or calculation. The mechanical revelation. "Let us begin with the locked room mystery," Poirot continued, approaching the evidence table with ceremonial deliberation. The duplicate key found in Mr. Dane's possession was a masterpiece of misdirection, convincing, logical, and completely impossible to use for its alleged purpose. He lifted Sir Everard's silver-handled walking stick, holding it where the morning light revealed the telltale scratches near its handle. "These marks, mes amis, correspond precisely to the brass fittings of Sir Everard's compartment window. The walking stick was employed as a lever inserted between window and frame to manipulate the latch mechanism from outside. Once entry was gained, the door could be genuinely bolted from within, creating our impossible crime." Moving to the demonstration window that Mr. Ellison had prepared, Poirot inserted the stick's handle into the bracket recess and applied gentle pressure. The mechanism yielded with a soft click that seemed to echo through the saloon like a gunshot. "Voilà," he said with quiet satisfaction. "A child could accomplish this, given knowledge of the method and access to the implement. No elaborate mechanical devices, no impossible alibis. Merely simple ingenuity applied with deadly precision." The chemical evidence. Turning to the cut-glass milk jug, Poirot held it to the light with the reverence of a scientist examining a rare specimen. The attempted silencing of Miss Lyle revealed our murderer's sophisticated understanding of chemistry. Chloral hydrate, administered in precisely calculated doses, masked with violet perfume to disguise the medicinal odor. The chiming sound we heard throughout this investigation was not crystal touching crystal, but the deliberate breaking of glass vials to release their contents. Dr. Hargreaves leaned forward with what appeared to be professional interest. Such knowledge would require considerable medical or pharmaceutical training. The precise dosage necessary to incapacitate without killing is not information readily available to laypeople. Precisely, Docteur, Poirot replied, his eyes resting on the physician with particular attention. Our murderer possesses expertise that extends far beyond common criminal knowledge. The timeline reconstruction. Now, let us address the conflicting testimonies regarding yesterday evening's crucial period. Poirot consulted his notebook with mathematical precision. Miss Marchmont claims entry at 8 o'clock, witnessing an argument between Sir Everard and an unidentified second man. Mr. Dane states dismissal at 8:15, with the door immediately locked. Miss Lyle heard an argument concluding at 8:20, followed by footsteps moving away. He looked up from his notes with the expression of a mathematics professor confronting an elegant proof. These accounts cannot all be accurate. Someone has constructed a deliberate fiction, and that someone understood exactly how logical minds would attempt to reconcile contradictory evidence. From his waistcoat pocket, he produced Miss Lyle's recovered notebook, its pages filled with her meticulous observations. The true timeline, recorded by our most reliable witness, tells a different story entirely. At 8:18, glass sound, like bell, then sash creak, gust of cold. The window entry. Mes amis, occurring precisely when our murderer required access. The psychological profile. We are dealing with a mind of considerable sophistication, Poirot observed, his voice carrying that particular quality of respectful acknowledgement reserved for worthy adversaries. Someone who understands not merely the mechanics of murder, but the psychology of investigation. They anticipated our search for means and opportunity, so they provided both in abundance, but attached to an innocent man. He gestured toward the elaborate false evidence that had been designed to implicate Felix Dane. The silk cord and hatpin, the duplicate key, all physically impossible to use for their alleged purpose, yet psychologically convincing to minds seeking simple solutions. Our murderer possesses the intellectual vanity of one who cannot resist demonstrating superior cleverness. The web of deception. The forged letter bearing Miss Marchmont's initials was created using theatrical stationery, paper available to someone with connections to dramatic enterprises. The violet perfume used throughout this case serves as a signature, linking the poisoning attempt to the original crime. Most significantly, the severing of our telegraph wires was not random vandalism, but calculated isolation. Our murderer required time to perfect their deception. Mrs. Whitfield's composure cracked visibly. You're suggesting that someone among us planned not merely murder, but our imprisonment as well. I suggest, madame, that someone among us understood exactly how long they would need to eliminate inconvenient witnesses and destroy compromising evidence. The storm provided opportunity, but human calculation provided the timing. The sealed verdict. Moving with deliberate ceremony, Poirot approached the sideboard and placed a sealed envelope upon its polished surface. He pressed the wax with his signet ring and held it to the light with theatrical precision. Within this envelope, he announced with quiet authority, I have written not merely a name, but a complete account of method and motive. If I am correct, the person whose identity it contains has much to fear before this day concludes. If I am mistaken, you will witness the rare spectacle of Hercule Poirot's fallibility. The effect was immediate and profound. Every passenger shifted uncomfortably, but I noticed that Dr. Hargreaves's professional mask slipped fractionally, revealing something that might have been calculation or desperation. The mounting pressure. One among you, Poirot continued, his eyes moving systematically from face to face, possesses the medical knowledge necessary for sophisticated poisoning. One among you had intimate access to Sir Everard's private affairs and personal habits. One among you understood railway mechanisms sufficiently to manipulate both window latches and telegraph equipment. One among you possessed the psychological insight to orchestrate such elaborate misdirection. He paused, allowing the weight of these observations to settle over the group like a suffocating blanket. Most significantly, one among you has demonstrated the intellectual arrogance that compels certain criminals to create puzzles rather than simply commit crimes. Pride, mes amis, is often the fatal flaw in otherwise perfect murders. The approaching revelation. The storm's assault on the windows had diminished to intermittent gusts, and in the distance we could hear the sound of approaching rescue, the whistle of an engine fighting through the drifts to reach our isolated sanctuary. Time was running short for secrets and deceptions. Before the authorities arrive, Poirot announced with quiet finality, I shall reveal not merely who committed this crime, but why they felt compelled to construct such an elaborate fiction to conceal their guilt. The little grey cells have perceived the complete pattern now, not just the mechanics of murder, but the psychology of desperation that drove someone to believe they could outwit justice through superior intelligence. He moved to the window, gazing out at the approaching rescue with the expression of a general who had successfully maneuvered his opponent into an impossible position. The endgame approaches, and with it, the moment when all masks must fall away to reveal the truth beneath. In that confined space, with the weight of inevitable revelation pressing in from all sides, I understood that we had reached the crucial moment where Poirot's legendary powers of deduction would converge into irrefutable truth. Someone among our fellow passengers was about to be exposed not merely as a murderer, but as the architect of the most elaborate psychological deception in Poirot's distinguished career. The final gathering had achieved its purpose. The pressure had been applied, the evidence presented, and the trap set. All that remained was for pride and desperation to compel the final, fatal mistake that would strip away the last vestiges of carefully constructed innocence. The grey morning light, struggling through the storm's diminishing fury, transformed the dining saloon into something resembling a courtroom awaiting final judgment. The distant whistle of the rescue engine grew steadily stronger, its approach marking the end of their isolation and the inevitable moment when official authority would demand answers that could no longer be evaded. Poirot stood before the assembled passengers with the quiet dignity of a judge preparing to deliver verdict, his keen eyes moving systematically from face to face as he prepared to strip away the elaborate fiction that had concealed murder beneath layers of misdirection and psychological manipulation. The moment of truth. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice carrying that particular quality of gentle finality that marked his greatest revelations. We have witnessed a crime of extraordinary sophistication, not merely in its execution, but in the elaborate deception constructed to conceal it. Someone among us has demonstrated both the intelligence to orchestrate murder and the psychological insight to manipulate our investigation at every turn. He gestured toward the evidence table where the accumulated clues lay arranged like exhibits in an elaborate inquest. Let us begin with the locked room mystery that has confounded us from the beginning. The duplicate key found in Mr. Dane's possession was a masterpiece of misdirection, convincing, logical, and completely useless for its alleged purpose. The mechanical solution, moving with ceremonial precision, Poirot lifted Sir Everard's silver-handled walking stick, its scratched surface catching the pale morning light. These marks, mes amis, tell the true story of entry. The walking stick was employed as a lever, inserted between window frame and sash to manipulate the latch mechanism from outside. Once entry was gained through the window, the compartment door could be genuinely bolted from within, creating our impossible crime. He approached the demonstration window that Mr. Ellison had prepared, inserting the stick's handle into the frame with practiced precision. The mechanism yielded with a soft click that seemed to echo through the saloon like a gunshot. A method requiring not brute force, but precise understanding of railway engineering, knowledge possessed by someone who had studied these mechanisms professionally. The chemical evidence. Turning to the cut-glass milk jug, Poirot held it where the morning light revealed the telltale residue of sophisticated chemistry. The attempted silencing of Miss Lyle demonstrated expertise that extends far beyond common criminal knowledge. Chloral hydrate, administered in precisely calculated doses, masked with violet perfume to disguise medicinal odors. The chiming sound we heard throughout this investigation was not crystal touching crystal, but the deliberate breaking of glass vials to release their measured contents. His eyes moved to Dr. Hargreaves, whose professional composure was beginning to show the first signs of strain. Such knowledge, Doctor, speaks to extensive pharmaceutical training. The precise dosage necessary to incapacitate without killing is not information readily available to laypeople. The timeline reconstruction. Now let us address the conflicting testimonies that have puzzled us. Poirot continued, consulting his meticulous notes. Miss Marchmont entered Sir Everard's compartment at 8 o'clock, witnessing an argument between him and a second man whose back was turned to her. She was ejected, but in his agitation, Sir Everard failed to lock the door immediately. Mr. Dane arrived at 8:15 for his scheduled appointment, received his dismissal, and departed with the door then properly secured. He paused, allowing the significance to settle. But between 8:15 and 8:20, when Miss Lyle heard the argument's violent conclusion, someone re-entered that compartment. Someone who possessed both the means and the desperate motivation to commit murder. The psychological profile. "We are dealing with a mind of considerable sophistication," Poirot observed, his voice carrying that particular quality of respectful acknowledgement reserved for worthy adversaries. "Someone who understands not merely the mechanics of murder, but the psychology of investigation. They anticipated our search for means and opportunity, so they provided both in abundance, but attached to an innocent man." He gestured toward the elaborate false evidence that had been designed to implicate Felix Dane. The silk cord and hatpin, the duplicate key, all physically impossible to use for their alleged purpose, yet psychologically convincing to minds seeking simple solutions. Our murderer possesses the intellectual vanity of one who cannot resist demonstrating superior cleverness. The web of corruption. "Dr. Hargreaves," Poirot said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "your connection to Sir Everard extended far beyond casual acquaintance. The parliamentary investigation into his petroleum concessions had uncovered irregularities that threatened to expose a network of corruption extending into the medical establishment." The physician's face went white as parchment, but his professional training held him rigid in his chair. Sir Everard's companies had been purchasing medical supplies at grossly inflated prices, with the excess profits being diverted to accounts controlled by complicit physicians. "You were not merely his doctor, but his partner in a systematic defrauding of government medical contracts. The anonymous letters that tormented him in recent months were not from unknown enemies, but from you, escalating pressure designed to ensure his continued cooperation and silence." The motive. Revealed. From his notebook, Poirot extracted a series of documents that had been concealed beneath his other papers. Sir Everard's private correspondence, recovered from his scattered papers, includes detailed records of payments made to L. Hargreaves for consulting services that bear no relationship to legitimate medical practice. When the parliamentary investigation began focusing on these financial irregularities, Sir Everard panicked. He threatened to expose the entire network to save himself from prosecution. Dr. Hargreaves' professional mask was beginning to crack, revealing the desperate calculation beneath. "You cannot prove such wild allegations. My practice has always been conducted with absolute integrity." "Your practice, perhaps," Poirot interrupted with quiet firmness. "But your investments tell a different story entirely. The violet perfume that has haunted this investigation is not a romantic affectation, but a professional signature. You have been developing proprietary pharmaceutical preparations using funds diverted from the government contracts. The same violet essence used to mask medicinal odors in your experimental compounds appears in both the letter that terrified Sir Everard and the chloral administered to Miss Lyle. The final confrontation. Yesterday evening, you met with Sir Everard at 8 o'clock, as Miss Marchmont witnessed. You argued about the parliamentary investigation, about the documents that could destroy both your careers, about his threat to expose your shared corruption. When he ejected Miss Marchmont, you realized this might be your only opportunity to silence him permanently. Poirot's voice grew more intense, his eyes fixed on the physician with laser-like focus. You waited until Mr. Dane's departure, then re-entered through the unlocked door. Sir Everard, already agitated by your earlier confrontation, was easily overcome by a precisely administered dose of digitalis, a cardiac stimulant that, in excessive quantities, produces rapid heart failure with symptoms that appear entirely natural to cursory examination. The elaborate deception. After the murder, you staged the scene with theatrical precision. You scattered his papers to simulate a search for compromising documents you yourself had written and then retrieved. You planted the false evidence on Mr. Dane, knowing his timid nature would make him a perfect scapegoat. The impossible mechanical devices, the duplicate key, all designed to point investigators toward an obvious, yet ultimately impossible solution. The rescue engine's whistle had grown considerably louder, and through the windows they could see figures moving through the snow toward their stranded train. Time was running short for secrets and confessions. You locked the door from within, then used the walking stick to manipulate the window latch from outside, exiting through the opening you had created. The scratches on the silver handle bear testament to its use as a lever, while the fresh air that Miss Lyle noted in her meticulous observations marked the moment of your escape. The collapse of deception. Dr. Hargreaves rose from his chair with jerky, uncontrolled movements, his professional composure finally abandoning him entirely. "Even if your elaborate theories contained some grain of truth," he said, his voice hoarse with desperation, "you cannot prove murder. Sir Everard died of natural causes. His heart simply failed under the pressure of his legal difficulties." His heart failed, Poirot agreed with deadly calm, but not from natural causes. You administered digitalis in a precisely calculated overdose, producing rapid cardiac arrest that would appear natural to any but the most sophisticated post-mortem examination. Your medical expertise allowed you to commit murder while leaving minimal physical evidence. The final evidence. "But you made one crucial error, Doctor," Poirot continued with quiet triumph. "In your desperation to silence Miss Lyle, you used the same violet-scented chloral preparation that you had employed to mask the digitalis administered to Sir Everard. Chemical analysis will reveal traces of both compounds, linked by their distinctive aromatic signature to your experimental pharmaceutical work." The sound of boots on metal steps announced the arrival of official authority, but Dr. Hargreaves's composure had already shattered completely. "Everard was going to destroy everything," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the approaching sounds of rescue. 20 years of careful research, legitimate medical advancement funded through irregular channels. He was prepared to sacrifice it all to save his own reputation. "So you sacrificed him instead," Poirot concluded with quiet finality. "But in doing so, you revealed the very corruption you sought to conceal. The little grey cells, Doctor, have perceived not merely the method of murder, but the entire web of deception that made it necessary." Justice served. As the rescue party entered the dining saloon, Dr. Leopold Hargreaves stood exposed as both murderer and architect of the most elaborate deception in Poirot's distinguished career. A man whose intellectual pride had compelled him to create a puzzle so complex that its very sophistication had ultimately betrayed him. The storm had finally broken, and with it, the last vestiges of the carefully constructed fiction that had concealed murder beneath layers of misdirection and false evidence. In that moment of revelation, with rescue at hand and justice served, Hercule Poirot had once again demonstrated that no deception, however elaborate, could withstand the inexorable logic of truth methodically pursued. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said quietly, adjusting his cufflinks with characteristic precision as the authorities took Dr. Hargreaves into custody. The little grey cells have completed their work. It is time we return to London, where the mysteries are perhaps less deadly, but no less fascinating to the mind that seeks to understand the complexities of human nature. The Northern Highland Express would continue its journey, but the passengers who had witnessed Hercule Poirot's methodical unraveling of murder and corruption would carry with them the profound understanding that justice, like truth, possesses an inexorable power that no amount of cleverness or deception can ultimately defeat. The rescue party arrived in a gust of icy air and the clean smell of coal smoke, their boots striking the metal treads with purposeful authority that marked the end of our isolation and the beginning of official reckoning. Inspector Bradshaw of the Yorkshire Constabulary followed in their wake, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had spent decades pursuing criminals through England's unforgiving countryside. His initial skepticism toward what he clearly perceived as amateur interference in serious police work was evident in every measured step and cautious glance. The sealed revelation. At Lady Isabel's quiet nod, Mr. Ellison produced Poirot's sealed envelope from the safe with ceremonial reverence. The inspector broke the wax with professional precision, read the contents in a murmured undertone, then lifted his gaze to survey the assembled passengers with new understanding. "Dr. Leopold Hargreaves," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. The collective exhalation that followed possessed the quality of a theatre audience witnessing the final revelation of a complex drama. Dr. Hargreaves did not struggle or protest. He sat with the rigid composure of a man conducting his final consultation, methodically unfastening his cuffs before extending his wrists with the mechanical precision that had characterized his professional life. "You have no proof beyond conjecture," he said, but the words emerged without conviction, like a prayer recited by one who had lost faith in its efficacy. The comprehensive evidence. Poirot, whose hands remained as composed as his eyes were bright with intellectual satisfaction, inclined his head with respectful acknowledgment of a worthy adversary finally defeated. "On the contrary, Doctor, we possess evidence that will satisfy both dramatic revelation and legal scrutiny." He gestured toward the accumulated proof with the precision of a master craftsman displaying his finest work. The telegraph wires, cut with surgical precision using medical scissors rather than crude tools. Your instrument roll bears an empty space where such scissors should rest, and the case's velvet lining shows fresh lint of black cotton, identical to that used to bind the severed wires. Inspector Bradshaw's expression shifted from skepticism to professional interest as Poirot continued his methodical presentation. The violet-scented residue upon the cut-glass milk jug and sugar tongs provides chemical evidence of sophisticated poisoning techniques. Miss Lyle's contemporaneous notes document the crucial timeline. 8:18, the chime of breaking glass, the breath of cold air, the window sash creaking under manipulation. Moving to the evidence table, Poirot lifted Sir Everard's silver-handled walking stick, its scratched surface catching the pale morning light. These marks correspond precisely to the window brackets of Sir Everard's compartment, demonstrating the method of entry that rendered our locked room mystery explicable through simple, mechanical ingenuity rather than impossible alibis. The broader conspiracy. Exposed. The search of Dr. Hargreaves's medical bag revealed not merely the predicted chemicals, digitalis and chloral hydrate, in quantities far exceeding legitimate medical requirements, but also a leather portfolio containing financial records that documented years of systematic fraud. Sir Everard's petroleum companies had been purchasing medical supplies at grossly inflated prices, with excess profits diverted to accounts controlled by a network of complicit physicians. "Inspector," Poirot explained with quiet authority, "this murder was not an isolated crime of passion, but the desperate act of a man whose elaborate conspiracy faced exposure. Dr. Hargreaves had been coordinating a network of physicians who diverted government medical contracts to fund private research, using Sir Everard's companies as conduits for money laundering. Inspector Bradshaw's expression grew increasingly grave as he reviewed the documentation. This extends far beyond a single murder. We're examining potential charges against dozens of individuals in positions of public trust. The parliamentary investigation that terrified Sir Everard merely scratched the surface of systematic corruption throughout the medical establishment. The human reckoning. As the evidence mounted with inexorable logic, Dr. Hargreaves' professional composure crumbled entirely, revealing the desperate calculation beneath his respectable facade. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the hollow quality of a man who had gambled everything on intellectual superiority and lost. 20 years of careful research, he whispered, speaking more to himself than to his captors. Legitimate medical advancement funded through irregular channels, discoveries that could benefit thousands of patients. Everard was prepared to destroy it all, cast decades of progress into the gutter to appease politicians who understand nothing of scientific necessity. His eyes found Miss Lyle, still pale from her ordeal, and something approaching regret flickered across his features. The dose would not have harmed you permanently, Miss Lyle. It was intended merely to prevent testimony that could have destroyed work of genuine medical value. You cannot dose the truth, sir, she replied with quiet dignity that belied her fragile appearance. It wakes again, stronger than before. The restoration of justice. Felix Dane, cleared of all suspicion but bearing the psychological scars of his ordeal, watched the proceedings with the hollow expression of one who had glimpsed his own destruction. I knew something was wrong, he admitted to Inspector Bradshaw. Sir Everard had been receiving threatening letters for months, growing increasingly paranoid. I thought it was business rivalry. I never imagined the threat came from someone he trusted with his very life. Mrs. Whitfield, her earlier moral indignation now tempered by the complexity of the revealed corruption, approached Felix with awkward dignity. I wronged you, young man. I can only say I am glad to have been proven wrong. Felix's response possessed the quiet courage that emerges when youth confronts genuine adversity. Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. I was more afraid of being thought a coward than of being thought a criminal. Sir Everard created weather in a room, if you understand me. It was difficult to breathe in his presence. You will breathe more freely now, Miss Eleanor Marchmont observed, moving to stand beside him with the decisive grace of one who had reached important conclusions about the future. Her presence beside Felix spoke of possibilities that extended far beyond the confines of their current circumstances. Captain Kinross stood apart with military bearing, his hands clasped behind him as if contemplating a battlefield finally pacified. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-deferred justice. Van's death denies me the satisfaction of seeing him answer in Parliament, yet it provides a different sort of reckoning, one that encompasses not merely his crimes, but the entire network of corruption that made them possible. Poirot's final observations. As Inspector Bradshaw completed his preliminary documentation and prepared to escort Dr. Hargreaves to formal custody, Poirot observed the proceedings with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters between dramatic revelation and legal proof. The little grey cells, he murmured to me as we watched justice take its inevitable course, are satisfied with the evening's work. Dr. Hargreaves possessed both the intelligence to orchestrate elaborate murder and the fatal flaw of intellectual vanity. He could not resist creating puzzles to demonstrate his superior cleverness, but puzzles, mon ami, exist to be solved by minds capable of patient observation and methodical deduction. He adjusted his cufflinks with characteristic precision, his gaze thoughtful as he watched the storm's final clouds dispersing beyond the windows. Pride that requires demonstration of superiority is the hand that arranges elaborate tableaux and expects applause. It is the applause I deny, Hastings. Justice arrives not through theatrical flourishes, but through the patient accumulation of truth methodically pursued, despite all attempts at misdirection. The journey's end. The Northern Highland Express, freed from its snowy imprisonment, prepared to resume its interrupted journey. The passengers who had witnessed Poirot's methodical unraveling of murder and conspiracy would carry with them profound understanding of justice's inexorable power, how no amount of cleverness or calculation could ultimately defeat truth patiently pursued. As the rescue engine coupled to our train and the familiar rhythm of wheels on rails resumed, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation of a simple journey into one of Poirot's most complex cases. We had witnessed not merely the solution of a murder, but the exposure of systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of British society. "Snow," Poirot observed, as we settled into our compartments for the journey south, "is the great leveler. It makes the world smooth without distinction. But beneath, there are the boundaries, the small fences, the footprints of truth. One waits, one listens. One does not rush to trample the surface. When it melts, the truth emerges, if one has possessed the patience not to destroy it through premature action." The affair at the train that stopped in the snowstorm had concluded with justice served and order restored, but its implications would resonate far beyond the confines of the Northern Highland Express. Dr. Leopold Hargreaves would face charges not merely for murder, but for conspiracy, fraud, and the systematic betrayal of medicine's most sacred trusts. His intellectual pride had compelled him to create deceptions so elaborate that their very sophistication had ultimately betrayed him, providing Hercule Poirot with the threads necessary to unravel an entire web of corruption. As we returned to London under skies gradually clearing to reveal the honest light of winter sun, I understood that we had participated in something more significant than the solution of a single crime. We had witnessed the triumph of methodical truth over elaborate deception, of patient justice over calculated corruption, and of human dignity over the intellectual arrogance that believes itself above moral law. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed not merely by snow, but by the harsh illumination of secrets exposed and justice finally served. The familiar rhythm of wheels on rails carried us through the transformed English countryside, where snow-laden fields stretched toward horizons made brilliant by afternoon sunlight, breaking through dispersing clouds. The Northern Highland Express had resumed its interrupted journey with the steady purpose of a great machine restored to proper function, yet within our first-class compartment, the atmosphere retained that peculiar quality of aftermath that follows the resolution of profound drama. The philosopher's victory. Poirot sat opposite me in his customary state of meticulous arrangement, his valise once again positioned at precise right angles beneath the seat, his umbrella aligned with mathematical exactitude in the overhead rack. Yet there was something different in his demeanor, a quality of thoughtful satisfaction that spoke not merely of another case solved, but of deeper truth revealed about the nature of human corruption and the inexorable power of justice methodically pursued. "Mon ami," he said, gazing out at the passing landscape with the expression of a philosopher contemplating eternal verities. "This case has demonstrated something most significant about the criminal mind when it possesses superior intelligence." Dr. Hargreaves was not content merely to commit murder. He required an audience for his cleverness, a stage upon which to display his intellectual superiority over those who would pursue him. He adjusted his cufflinks with characteristic precision, his movements betraying none of the satisfaction that glittered in his keen eyes. It is the vanity of the educated criminal, Hastings. They cannot resist the temptation to create elaborate puzzles, to demonstrate that they are more clever than their pursuers. But in creating puzzles, they provide the very clues necessary for their own detection. The passing landscape seemed to underscore his observations. The snow that had concealed so much was melting under honest sunlight, revealing the true contours of the countryside beneath. His greatest mistake, Poirot continued, was his intellectual vanity. He could not resist adding unnecessary complications, leaving subtle clues, arranging false evidence with theatrical flourish, all to prove his cleverness. The precise cutting of the telegraph wires with medical scissors, the elaborate planting of evidence on poor Mr. Dane, the violet perfume as his signature. These were not strictly necessary for the crime itself, but they were essential for Hargreaves's self-conception as a criminal genius. The human reckoning. The revelations aboard our snow-bound sanctuary had triggered consequences that extended far beyond the confines of our temporary prison. Inspector Bradshaw's preliminary examination of Dr. Hargreaves' financial records had exposed a conspiracy involving dozens of physicians, government officials, and private contractors who had systematically defrauded medical supply contracts for nearly a decade. As we approached London, letters began arriving at stations along our route, forwarded by efficient railway post. Lady Isabel wrote in her strong, determined hand to say the Marchmont Gala had been postponed and the funds diverted to relief for villages cut off by the storm. It is perhaps more in the spirit of charity, she added, to give where necessity commands rather than society approves. There was a postscript in different ink and a lighter touch. Miss Eleanor's, thanking Poirot and inviting Mr. Felix Dane to a future that included not only recovered reputation, but genuine affection founded on shared adversity. Mrs. Whitfield had enclosed a donation receipt made out to a fund established in the name of Lieutenant William Kinross for soldiers injured by defective munitions. "It is a poor substitute for justice," she wrote, "but perhaps a better companion to it than bitterness." Captain Kinross's own note was characteristically laconic. "I'm ordered to testify before committee. Better late than never." Yet even in those few words lay the easing of a weight long borne. Miss Beatrice Lyle sent a small parcel containing a tidy notebook bound in blue leather with a careful inscription, "For the preservation of useful facts and the comfort of anxious minds." Poirot held it with uncharacteristic tenderness. "It is not always the dramatic gesture that holds the world together, Hastings," he observed. "Sometimes it is the faithful little note, the careful observation, the quiet courage of those who record truth without fanfare. The network's downfall." The irony, Poirot reflected as we watched telegraph crews repairing the lines that Dr. Hargreaves had severed, is that our doctor genuinely believed his research justified the means employed to fund it. He convinced himself that medical advancement excused systematic theft from the public treasury. It is the corruption of the intellectual. They create elaborate moral justifications for simple greed. The sight of those restored communication lines seemed to please him enormously. Truth is like the telegraph system, n'est-ce pas? One may cut the wires temporarily, but the infrastructure remains. The connections are restored, and the messages flow again, often with greater urgency than before. The parliamentary investigation, armed with Dr. Hargreaves's detailed financial records, would pursue accountability throughout the network of complicit officials and contractors. Captain Kinross had found unexpected satisfaction in this broader justice. "I sought personal satisfaction for my brother's death, but instead I've witnessed the exposure of systematic corruption that killed hundreds of soldiers through defective equipment. The scope of accountability will extend far beyond what any individual revenge could achieve." The method vindicated. This case, Poirot reflected as the familiar outskirts of London began to appear, demonstrates the superiority of psychological observation over physical evidence in complex criminal investigations. The mechanical clues, the walking stick, the duplicate key, the silk cord, were all misdirection designed to focus attention on false solutions. He consulted his pocket watch with the precision of a man whose relationship with time had been refined by decades of methodical investigation. But human psychology cannot be falsified as easily as physical evidence. Dr. Hargreaves could plant false clues, manipulate testimonies, create elaborate alibis, but he could not disguise the fundamental arrogance that compelled him to demonstrate his intellectual superiority. As we prepared for our arrival at King's Cross, Poirot made his final observations about the case that had tested his abilities so thoroughly. Intelligence without moral foundation becomes merely cleverness, and cleverness in service of corruption ultimately destroys itself through its own vanity. Dr. Hargreaves possessed the intellectual capacity for genuine medical advancement, but he chose to employ that capacity in service of greed disguised as scientific necessity. The restoration of order. We reached London on a morning that made the city look as if it had been polished with cold water and honest light. The story had already travelled ahead of us by that uncanny telegraphy which requires no wires. A death upon a snow-bound train, a celebrated physician arrested, a Belgian detective among the passengers. At Victoria, Inspector Bradshaw took his leave with stolid gratitude and a promise to wire when laboratory analysis confirmed what Poirot's method had already established in the realm of reason. "Even in victory, Hastings," Poirot murmured, allowing himself an extra moment to check the angle of his hat in a window. "One must present to the world the correctness. It restores the equilibrium." As we stepped onto the platform, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation of what had begun as a simple journey to a charity gala. We had witnessed murder, conspiracy, and the systematic corruption of institutions that society trusted to serve the public good. Yet we had also witnessed the triumph of methodical investigation over elaborate deception, of moral courage over intellectual arrogance. Epilogue. The final word. 6 months later, the newspapers would report that Dr. Leopold Hargreaves had been sentenced to life imprisonment for murder and conspiracy, while 17 other physicians and officials faced charges related to the systematic fraud he had orchestrated. The medical advances he claimed to justify his crimes were found to be largely fabricated, existing more in his grandiose imagination than in scientific reality. Felix Dane married Miss Eleanor Marchmont in a quiet ceremony attended by Lady Isabel and the other survivors of their extraordinary ordeal. Their shared experience of terror and reprieve had forged bonds stronger than social convention, proving that authentic character emerges most clearly under the pressure of genuine adversity. Mr. Hugo Drake did indeed write his play about the affair, though he discovered, as he confessed to Poirot, the narrowness of art in the face of exact truth. Your sealed envelope, that was theatre of the most refined order, but it worked only because it already contained what it must contain. Without that, it is merely paper, sealing wax, and pretension. The Northern Highland Express continued its regular service, though passengers occasionally remarked on the excellent condition of the window latches in the first-class compartments. A testament to Mr. Ellison's determination that no such mechanical ingenuity would again serve criminal purposes on his watch. And Hercule Poirot returned to his comfortable rooms in Whitehaven Mansions, where George welcomed us with the calm of a man for whom snowstorms, murder, and parliamentary scandal ranked slightly below a misaligned trouser crease. Over breakfast the next morning, Poirot made his final observation about the case that had tested his legendary powers so thoroughly. The human heart, mon ami, is a landscape far more complex and treacherous than any physical terrain. It contains valleys of despair, mountains of ambition, and hidden chasms of resentment. Dr. Hargreaves believed he could navigate this landscape through superior intelligence alone, but intelligence without moral compass leads inevitably to destruction. He folded his napkin with characteristic precision and rose from the table. "Snow or no snow, Hastings, truth prefers the straight line. It may be temporarily obscured by storms of deception, but it possesses an inexorable power that no amount of cleverness can ultimately defeat. The little gray cells, they are patient, they are methodical, and they are, in the end, irresistible." With those words, Hercule Poirot closed the case of The affair at the train that stopped in the snowstorm, adding another testament to his files of the eternal struggle between human corruption and the inexorable triumph of justice methodically pursued. The storm had passed, the truth had been revealed, and order had been restored. Yet another demonstration that no deception, however elaborate, could withstand the patient application of logic, observation, and an unwavering commitment to the revelation of truth.